Afternoon, Rabbi Polsky.
Rabbi, you're on mute.
Okay, friends, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get started right on time here. So thank you so much for being here. And, we really believe that halakha and the Jewish tradition at large is not just about history. It is not just about ritual, but it is about the soul. And even beyond the soul, it is about society. It is about society. And that we should be at the forefront of thinking about and responding to some of the most pressing moral issues in our time. And so here we have a presentation today about a 40 to 45 minute presentation, followed by a chance for about 15, 20 minutes of questions and conversation, where Rabbi Polsky has done some significant work around how he wants to apply Jewish law, how he sees Jewish apply best to fit for this question of police accountability, which has been a long issue, but has come to the forefront all the more so since the George Floyd riots, as America truly seems to be ready to grapple with some of these issues in ways that it hasn't grappled with sufficiently in the past. And so you are welcome to chat in the side during the presentation. And then as shared, you'll have the opportunity to speak at the end. This will be recorded as always, because I know many people want to access the recording while they're cooking or jogging or whatever they do. But you have the great benefit to be in the live space and to engage in real time with these sources. We can also share the source sheet with you and the longer article, in addition to it just being the PowerPoint. And Eddie or AJ can do that over there, or Rabbi Polsky can do that. So let's jump right in. Rabbi David Polsky is a local rabbi and educator living in the Detroit metropolitan area with his wife and two girls. He's currently working as the mashkiach and sous chef at Hillel Day School. He's also in the process of working with Kids Kicking Cancer to enable their wellness curriculum to be used in Jewish day schools. Among his many volunteer activities are serving as the scholar in residence for Congregation Beit Levitz, Program Associate for the Detroit Center for Civil Discourse, the Limud Steering Committee, and the Coalition for Black and Jewish Unity Advisory Committee. He has also served as a Judaic Studies educator at the Frankel Jewish Academy. Before moving to Michigan 4.5 years ago, Rabbi Polsky served as a congregational rabbi in New Orleans for 5 years. So Rabbi David Polsky, take it away. Thank you for being here to guide us.
Thank you so much, truly. Thank you so much, Eddie Chavez Calderon. And thank you for joining me. All right, so there's a whole lot to cover, so I'll get started. So as truly noted, so this is I'm going to be covering a lot of sources, but this is actually taken from a much larger article that I'm writing and editing and hoping to publish. So hopefully if you see this, some of this presentation, well, if you think it could be a little bit more nuanced, like a little bit richer. So it's really because I'm taking from a whole lot of other sources. I'm really trying to condense as much as possible. All right. Okay, so the murder of George Floyd in May brought a greater awareness of the brutality of police towards Black people and other marginalized communities. Jacob Blake, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, and so many others show how police are rarely, if ever, held accountable for their crimes. And many Jews, as Reb Shmuley had noted, have, including Purim Jews, have taken part in protests for the cause of Black lives. Have shouted phrases, have used concepts called tikkun olam, the idea of the ger, of the stranger, the idea of tzedek tirdo. But what I want to do is bring a whole lot more detailed sources, because I think that halacha and classical halacha has a lot to offer this conversation. Okay. Now, first, before I go any further, I'm going to say that certainly in the times of the rabbis, there was nothing like the modern organized police force. However, there was something in the time of the rabbis called a shliach beis din. By the way, also, excuse me for not code switching to Havara Sfardit, so please excuse my Ashkenazis. So there was a shliach beis din. literally an agent of the court. And so his job was, he had a number of different jobs. So he could do a number of things as a messenger for the court. So among them was administering lashes to those who violated biblical commandments. He would occasionally enforce monetary rulings, would collect debts or stolen property. Sometimes he would serve divorce papers. And occasionally, and this is where some force, the use of force could come in, is that he could end up bringing a recalcitrant litigant to court. Also, there are some sources, in fact, some of them I'm going to discuss, that might also possibly suggest that he could have been empowered to save someone who was being assaulted. And clearly, the court officer was permitted to employ force when necessary. Also, I want to emphasize that these cases and rulings I'm going to be discussing, they certainly don't fit into modern left-right categories with regard to conceptions of the police. So even though I'm going to be discussing modifications about the use of force, about accountability for the use of force, I do want to just also note that that certainly there are some aspects of rabbinic conceptions. Oh, okay. About rabbinic conceptions about the power of the court officer to use force, which certainly would not fit in with modern sensibilities. So, for example, many of us are familiar with a Talmudic passage that if a man refuses to grant his wife a get, a legal bill of divorce, that he could be beaten until he agrees. In fact, there's also a passage in the Yerushalmi that says, I think Rav, if I remember correctly, would administer lashes or put someone in, excommunicate someone who disrespects a shliach beis din, the court messenger. So that also, even though obviously police using force when they feel that they're disrespected certainly unfortunately does happen, but certainly it does not fit into our legal, our moral sensibility. So I just want to emphasize that that imposing these modern categories would still be considered a little anachronistic. But that being said, I think that these halachic sources have a lot to teach us with regard to the use of force. Okay, so I'm going to start with source 2. I'm just going to summarize source 2. Sources 2 and 3 discuss the issue of Aved Nishdin L'Nashe, the ability of someone to take the law into one's own hand. So if, let's say, if someone steals from me, am I allowed to employ force in order to take back what that person stole, or do I have to employ the court system? And so there's a long Talmudic section that discusses this issue, but there's an opening story that opens off this debate, and that is a story again as in source 2. There's two partners in a well, and they alternate days. Partner A has the well on one day, and then partner B has it on the other day. And so one day, partner A comes to the well on his own day, and he sees partner B is using the well on his own day, and so he beats B with a hoe 100 times, beats him with a hoe, and Rav Nachman responds, the Amora responds by saying that he was right to do so. In fact, he should have even beat him 100 times with a hoe. And then he explains that even according to the opinion that lo Aved Nishdin L'Nashe, that a person should always use the court system and not take the law into one's own hands and employ self-help. Even that opinion would agree that that someone that in a case of loss, that if I'm going to lose out by going into taking that person to court, that I'm allowed to use self-help. In other words, employ force in order to take the law into my own hands. Okay, so that is the background for source 3, because this gets into a lot of nuances. So we have an attempted proof in source 3. The Gemara tries to bring a midrashic text to try to prove lo avid inishtin l'nashe, that a person is not allowed to take the law into their own hands. Okay, so the attempted proof is as follows. So most of the sources I'm going to mostly summarize, but this has I'm going to try to mostly read follow step by step. Okay, so it says so it begins Tashma. Okay, and it's so come in here proof, and the proof has to do with a story in the Torah. The Torah says that if two men are fighting and a woman sees her husband being beaten, and then in order to defend her husband, she grabs the person assaulting her husband. She grabs him by her genitals, by his genitals. Sorry. And so then, I mean, in the language of the Torah, it says that her hand is cut off. But the rabbis interpret it and say, no, definitely no way her hand would be cut off. It just really means that that she would have to pay restitution for embarrassing that person whose genitals she grabbed. Okay, so the Gemara asks, so my love b'she'ena yechola lahatzil al yedei davar acher. So what's going on in this case? Did she have any alternative but to use force in order to defend her husband? And because if she would she have been able to de-escalate the situation? Could she have defended her husband and protected her husband without using this form of brutal force and embarrassing force? And because it seems, so my love so the Gemara assumes at this point that that she could not, that grabbing the other man by the genitals was the only way to protect her husband. But if that's the case, if that is the assumption, if that's what's going on in this case, in this verse in the Torah, so then it would be saying that even though she was trying to protect her husband, even though she had had no choice, she still has to pay restitution for her use of force. Okay, and therefore this would therefore suggest, the Gemara tries to prove that that lo avid inishtin l'nashe, that a person is not allowed to take the law into their own hands. They always have to go through court, even when they would have no other choice. And so then the Gemara responds by saying, lo, sheychol lahatzil al yedei davar acher. Then no, the reason why the woman has to pay is that she could have used other means in order to protect her husband. She didn't. She could have. She didn't have to grab the man's genitals. She could have, I don't know, convinced the man to stop beating her husband. And it's only because she used force unnecessarily. She used force when it wasn't necessary. So that's why she has to pay. However, However, if it were a case where she had no other choice but to use force in order to protect her husband, then she would have been exempt. She wouldn't have had to pay the money. Okay, so then the Gemara challenges this because there doesn't seem to be any inherent distinction in the text between whether or not the woman could have protected her husband by other means. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi adatani seifa," because the conclusion of that midrash says as follows: "V'shal hayada prat l'shliach beis din." So the Torah says that she sends her hands in order to grabbing this man's genitals. So the midrash makes a deduction prat l'shliach beis din that this is to exclude a court messenger from being liable. That, in other words, that even though the woman is liable, but for such a case of that employing force, but seemingly, in the same exact type of case, a court messenger would have been exempt because he has the force of law or some other reason. So the Gemara challenges liflog velisni b'dida. So it should have made this this specific distinction. B'medvar memurim b'sheyechol lahatzil al yedei davar acher. That the midrash itself should have said distinguished between necessary force and unnecessary force. It should have made that distinction in the text. However, in other words, the midrash should have specified and said that if the woman had no other choice but to use force in order to protect her husband, she would have been exempt. So the Gemara answers by, again, defending the opinion of Avid and Ishtin Lanashe, the opinion that says that that one is allowed to take the law into their own hands. So the Gemara responds by saying, Hachinami Kamar, you're right. But Medvar Mavurim, this is what the Midrash is really saying. When does it say that the woman would be liable? When she could have saved her husband by other means. However, if she had no other choice, if she had no other way to protect her husband, so the reason why the Midrash brings in Shliach Beis Din, the court messenger, into this discussion is because if the woman had no other way of protecting her husband, and she therefore uses force, whether grabbing the other man's genitals or I don't know, or some other physical means to protect her husband, so then she would be acting as if she herself were also a Shliach Beis Din, as if she herself was an officer of the law, and thus she would be exempt. Okay. So again, this was a lot of different steps, but the reason why I went through this step by step is because we're going to see a number of sources that base themselves off of this exchange. So first is Rashi, which is source 4, and I should note that the title of this presentation, For Justice Has Not Been Done, is actually based on sources number 4 and 5. So Rashi explains, again, in source number 4, I'll try to just summarize. So Rashi just says, first explains the step that maybe she could have saved her husband by other means, because she was executing justice, but she could have possibly done it in other ways, but she was still executing justice, but not. And so the fact, according to Rashi, that she would still be liable, therefore shows that that one is not allowed to take the law into one's own hands. Okay, but then Rashi explains the response by the Gemara, when the Gemara responds and says that she could have saved by other means, and yet she still employs force in order to protect her husband. In other words, she was using force that was unnecessary. So Rashi says, "De lo dina avda." She has not acted according to justice. Justice has not been done. In other words, justice assumes that. Well, actually, I'll take a step back. Many of us would tend to assume, okay, let's say the police officer or someone else, let's say carried out the law or enforced the law, but let's say maybe as a side point, they might have used excessive force. But Rashi, I think, is hinting at the notion that using unnecessary force, therefore by definition, means that the act of force was not acting as the cause of justice. In other words, that whoever it is, whether it's a police officer or someone else, is not actually executing justice when they use excessive force. And I think that this Rashi and then Tosfos in source 5 that say that use very similar language, I think really contribute towards towards this discussion that that justice, that whenever there is excessive force, justice is not being done. Okay, so I'm going to now take a look at the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, in source 6. So he discusses a different dimension, but what I find very interesting is that he is going to at least offhand assume that an officer of the law is expected to remain calm, such that, well, in those days, who is he? So that's why I'll forgive me for using he. Therefore, he would be expected to remain calm, such that he would be able to de-escalate or accomplish his mission or goals without having to use force. Okay, so in source number 6, and I'll try to just summarize it. So Rabbeinu Asher is bothered by something that, again, the Midrash had said that V'shalcha yada, that the woman extends her hand, and that is to the exclusion of the shliach beis din, of the court messenger. And so for Rabbeinu Asher, he's bothered by something because the very fact that we have a midrashic exclusion of the court officer would suggest that even though it's the same exact case between let's say the woman defending her husband and let's say the court officer, possibly if there was a shliach beis din who was trying to defend a similar person, protect a similar person who was being assaulted, that they're dealing with the same exact case, and yet the shliach beis din would be exempt from damages, while the woman would be liable for damages. And he's bothered by at least the Rabbeinu Asher also takes it for granted that it absolutely just cannot be that the court officer could use unnecessary force and still be exempt. It just absolutely can't be in Rabbeinu Asher's mind. It just can't be. So therefore, so why, let's say, so if we're dealing with the same exact case, and the woman is liable, but the court officer is exempt. So what exactly is going on? So Rabbeinu and the other, and also part of the dimension is if the woman is using necessary force, right? So why should she be liable? So again, if the parallel case between the woman and the court officer is a case of unnecessary force, so he says the court officer should be liable either. If it's a case of necessary force that the woman and the court officer share, so then why should the woman be liable? So Rabbeinu Asher explains in the conclusion of the source that what's parallel, that it's not necessarily that what's parallel is not a case of necessary force versus unnecessary force. What's happening is that the woman and the court officer could be presented with the same exact situation. So he says that they're dealing with the same exact situation, but he says the woman is distressed, is so, I guess, anxious or distressed from seeing her husband being beaten, that she is not able to think clearly, and therefore is going to end up using force when it is not, even though it is not necessary. On the other hand, he says, or suggests, the shliach beis din, the court officer, would be able to assess the situation calmly and professionally, and would therefore be able to either de-escalate the situation or just do something to enable him. Again, I'm using him for the past. Again, enable him to accomplish his goals without having to use force. So again, so we have this. So Rabbeinu Ashir has this expectation that an officer of the law should be able to think clearly and calmly, and is expected, if at all possible, to know how to accomplish his mission and his goals without the use of force, or to at least minimize the use of force. Okay, I'm just going to summarize this, but in terms of this idea that a professional employing should be expected to remain as calm as possible, is sort of totally different from, let's say, police or shliach beis, an officer of the law, but is discussed by Igros Moshe, by Rav Moshe Feinstein. So he discusses the case of surgery, where something, let's say, if surgery goes wrong and something happens, if the patient dies, so then what is the theoretical degree of liability for the physician who would make a mistake? So in the course of towards the end of his discussion, Rav Moshe says, "Ve'im haya bivhilas," that if he was like, so if the physician made a mistake because he was so distressed and he couldn't focus, he wasn't thinking clearly, and he takes more invasive means within the surgery than necessary. So hu kipshia, it's considered as if he's negligent. So this, well, actually, I'm not going to discuss this at length, but if someone is at least in the times of the Talmud, if someone is kills someone by accident, so then they're exiled. But if a person like kills someone that's it's not on purpose, but it's considered not accidental, but sort of like in between. If it's considered at least sort of more towards being on purpose or considered negligent, so then that case is considered beyond go. So this not so accidental murderer is not even atoned for. He's not even able to atone for himself or protect himself by being exiled. And so what Rav Moshe Feinstein is saying is that in the case of the physician, if his lack of mental clarity, or his or her lack of mental clarity, keeps them from being able to focus and assess the situation properly, and therefore using more invasive means, and through which, and because of which their patient dies. So that is considered negligence. So obviously, we know that, we could probably imagine that a police officer might be in more personal danger than let's say a doctor. So obviously there are different stresses. However, we do see this concept of that a trained professional should be able to remain calm despite the circumstances to whatever degree possible. Okay, another source is source 12. So source 12, the Nimukei Yosef. So Nimukei Yosef, it's a commentary on the Rif. So Nimukei Yosef connects the idea of to shliach beis din. He actually says it explicitly that the shliach beis din, the court officer, is only allowed to use force when absolutely necessary. And in order to do so, remember we were talking about the well case, right, where the person beat his partner with a hoe for using the well on his day. So Nimukei Yosef reads into that situation that that the partner had absolutely no other choice. There's no way that he had no other way to prevent his partner from stopping his use of the well without this use of force. In other words, he had no choice. Whether or not that's the actual explanation or the pshat, I mean that's for another discussion. But the fact that Nemuke Yosef feels the need to read that into the story, therefore shows again that he also believes that unnecessary force is absolutely never justified, and Nemuke Yosef actually connects that story to the Shliach Beis Din. That the Nemuke Yosef says that by extension, if the person at the well is allowed to use force, so certainly an officer of the law should also be allowed to use force. However, what's important is that that Nemuke Yosef explicitly constrains the Shliach Beis Din, the court officer, to say that even the court officer is not allowed to use force if it's not absolutely necessary. And also, we were discussing Rabbeinu Asher before, so I just want to summarize source 14. So the question is, okay, so let's say someone has to use force. Okay, but let's say they have a choice, or let's say they have an option to use a greater degree of force or a lesser degree of force. So according to the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, in source number 14, he says that even within the use of force, if let's say the Shliach Beis Din or someone else uses greater force than was absolutely necessary, so then that is also subject to liability. And therefore, even if force is necessary, there is an obligation by both the court officer and anyone else to minimize their use of force to whatever degree possible. And he actually brings a proof from the Gemara in Sanhedrin 74a. Unfortunately, there's definitely a side point with that I don't know if I'll have time to discuss this in depth, but the Gemara over there says that discusses the case of a rodave. One person is person A is chasing after B and trying to kill them, and the law is that we save B's life even if we have to kill A. But what happens if, let's say, someone I'm looking at this to the side, I'm looking at the situation, and I have the ability to stop A from killing B, but instead of, let's say, I don't know, just holding him down or being him by the legs or doing something else, when I have I could have saved B without using deadly force, but I did so anyway. So according to the Gemara in Sanhedrin on 74a, that person, the person who kills in order to save another when it's not necessary is considered a murderer. So even to save someone's life, using a greater degree of force or deadly force when it was not absolutely necessary is considered murder. And so Rabbeinu Asher says that certainly if that's the case, even to save someone's life, using unnecessary deadly force would be considered murder. So certainly the same should be the case in using a greater degree of force than necessary. Okay, so now, okay. So there's one source. Okay, I guess I'll try to discuss it in brief. Okay, so again, so I discussed this idea in the Gemara Sanhedrin, which is found on source 19. So again, if I try to save B while if I save B by killing A when it wasn't necessary, so then I would be considered a murderer. So the Mishnah Lamelech is one of the commentaries on the Mishnah Torah, on the on Maimonides' magnum opus on work of halacha, the Mishnah Torah. So the Mishnah Lamelech in source 20 tries to say that if that this idea that that the person is a murderer by using unnecessary deadly force, that's only if it's a side observer. But he says, if let's say I'm the one who's being chased after, whose life is in danger, Mishnah Lamelech says that that's expected that I would be so distressed and so agitated that it's sort of understood that that I might use deadly force when it's not necessary. And unfortunately, as we all know, this idea of police officers being afraid or at least claiming that they're afraid for their lives. I mean, for example, many of us are familiar with the case of Philando Castile, who is driving with his family, gets pulled over. And a cop at least claimed that Philando Castile was a gun owner. He tried to follow the directions as well as possible, but the cop was like very confusing. And the cop shoots him, like right in front of his family, even though he was trying to follow the officer's instructions. And then the police officer said later on, because I smelt marijuana. So if he is going to smoke marijuana with his kids around, so who knows what he would do to me? I felt I was in danger, and he said, and that's partially why he shot him. So in other words, unfortunately, we see many cases in which, let's say, police officers claim that they were acting in self-defense, and that's why they used excessive deadly force. Now, I'll try to discuss it, be very, very brief about this. There is a Gemara in Sanhedrin that seems to challenge it. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's a case in which someone is considered guilty of murder, even though he was still protecting himself, even though he himself was being chased after. It's a midrash based on a story with Yoav and Avner and Asahel. And that Gemara seems to take for granted that that even to protect oneself, using unnecessary deadly force is still murder. So one of the explanations that I like that offers a lot of food for thought is a distinction. Is an attempted defense by Rabbi Yosef Shaul ben Aryeh Leibush Nitanzon in his Shoel Meshiv. So he makes a distinction between who initiated the action. That if let's say I initiated the action, I started a confrontation, and so if I'm the one who started the confrontation, so then I should be expected to minimize the use of force, and therefore if I use unnecessary deadly force, so then I'm guilty of murder. So in other words, if I'm the one who starts the confrontation, then I have the obligation to minimize force, and maybe that might be distinguished from someone who did not initiate the conversation. So unfortunately, so this raises the question of police bias. If let's say if a police officer stops a black person for jaywalking, as was the case for, let's say, Michael Brown by Darren Wilson, and then let's say the confrontation escalates. So how would this idea of the Shoel Meshiv apply? And so I just want to raise the possibility that if the officer was biased by and initiated the encounter because of bias, so then that might be a case of the officer initiating the encounter, and would fit into this, would be applicable to this case of the Shoel Meshiv. I did want to just conclude again, because I only have 5 minutes left, the issue of qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is unfortunately legal doctrine, which says that police officers are not liable for excessive force or even doing something illegal, violating people's civil rights. They're exempt from liability unless the Supreme Court says they either knew or absolutely should clearly have known, unless it should have been totally obvious to them that what they were doing in this particular situation was illegal. And there's a number of articles that discuss how difficult it is to prove liability, to establish liability, because in many situations the officer could just say, "Oh, I didn't know," or "I wasn't sure," or let's say, or in some cases, it was established that such an action in such a situation would be a case of excessive force in one jurisdiction, but if it is not the case in the jurisdiction of this particular police officer, so then also qualified immunity would apply. So in that, again, I don't have time to really go into all of the details, but there is a Tosefta in Gittin. It's source 25, which discusses the concept of tikkun olam, about making the world a better place, about trying to fix society. So in this Tosefta, again, in source 25, the Tosefta says that if a court officer damages or beats someone, based in Vehizik. So let's say someone causes either harm or damage. So b'shogeg, if that court officer caused this damage or caused this harm unintentionally, so then again, using past history, he would be exempt. However, b'mezid, however, if he caused damage intentionally, so then he would be liable, and that this is all mipnei tikkun olam, because of this principle of making the world a better place. So to explain, the Taj Beitz Rav Shimon ben Tzemach Duran explains in a tshuva that normally in a regular case, the average person, if I do any sort of unintentional damage, I would be liable. I would be liable for damage, even if, let's say, I damaged something unintentionally. So he explains that that this idea that the court officer would be exempt for unintentional damage is a special decree on the part of the rabbis, because they were afraid that let's say that if let's say someone could be liable for unintentional damages, and the shliach beis din is someone who has to use force in a number of cases. So someone would say, why would I want to be a shliach beis din? Why would I want to be a court officer when I could be liable even for unintentional damage? And so therefore, in order to encourage qualified people to serve as shluchei beis din, so therefore they made a special exception and said that unintentional damage is exempt. However, based on the Chazan Yechezkel Abramsky, so he understands this distinction of between shogeg and mezid, and with this I'm gonna wrap up. So he says that that b'shogeg means that that I did not intend to do this particular damage. In other words, that any damage or harm happened by accident. And so this degree of immunity on the part of the rabbis for unintentional damage, it's only when I did not directly intend to cause damage. However, let's say in a case where I knew what I was doing, let's say the court officer knows what they're doing, so then they would be liable. And so I would like to, so I think based on this idea, so I just want to distinguish, because none of the rabbis who discuss the Gemara in Bava Kama discuss the Tosefta or really seem to link it together. So basically, I would say my thesis is that whenever there's unnecessary force, so then that is under the rubric of the Gemara in Baba Kama, that even the court officer would be liable for damages, and the only degree of immunity is only when in a case where they are doing damage or harm by accident. Otherwise, it is only when that degree of damage and force is absolutely necessary. But this degree of immunity is only really for unintentional damage. So again, I realize that there's a whole lot there. Happy to take questions even past the time. I realize there was a whole lot, but there's a lot of sources that I didn't even have time to get into. But I really appreciate you following along, and I really think that at least this should be the beginning of a conversation and thought about what halacha can contribute towards this issue of police accountability.
Thank you, Reb David, Rabbi Polsky. This is incredibly rich learning here. So let's open up the floor, friends, for questions you may have for Rabbi Polsky about any of this content or its application. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
I just want to say thank you, meaning I particularly liked the rushes. This is Nechama. I'm not turning on my camera because it's late here and I'm not dressed for a camera. But I really like to see the source sheets, and you've gotten me thinking about how to pull, it's an incredibly important topic. And your breakdown of when force is necessary, when it's not. I particularly liked the rush, the bahala, the idea that if you are overwhelmed with anxiety, stress, the situation, there might be different criteria. So I don't really have a question. I think I'd like to see more of the sources. I liked the beginning of the analysis. It is a very large topic, but I think there's a lot to do with these sources in terms of beginning to pull together a halachic position. So just thank you.
Oh yes, and definitely I would love to be in touch with you about sharing my more lengthy articles so you could see it in greater depth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I teach in Pardes, I teach in a gap year program, and I'd like to take some of these sources and work through them as well. So it's very exciting. Thank you.
Yes, I'd love to be in touch.
Okay, great.
Great, someone else.
This is Rita speaking.
Mhm.
My internet isn't so strong, so I switched it to no video. I'm reminded of the phrase "Tov she'berofim lagehinom."
Yes.
In terms of thinking about the shaliach based in
Yes.
responsibility. That's one. And I don't know if that's a thread to go off on, but also when you think about the origin of America's policing system, when you add that into the mix of what does it mean to be doing something intentionally versus unintentionally, it makes it seem much more culpable, the excessive use of force.
Oh yes. Actually, as part of my article, I do get into this issue of about possibly some criteria of whether or not an unbiased officer. So again, it's a theoretically unbiased officer, whether or not they would employ force or deadly force in such a situation should definitely enter into the conversation. So yes, definitely. Definitely there's more to discuss in terms of the degree of partially on purpose and so yes, Rita, those dimensions are really important.
How do you think about the translation of halachic details into our voice in public policy advocacy?
That's a really good in the sense of translating these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, we know what it means to like have a complex political position based on Torah and then show up at a rally that with a sign that's very simple, right?
Yeah.
Or sign a petition that's very simple. But what does
Yeah.
it mean to kind of be in the nitty-gritty halacha and how that informs the way we speak differently? We add a different kind of voice in society based on the nitty-gritty, shuvot.
That's a really great question. I mean, obviously, I certainly wouldn't. When hopefully at some point I hope to attend another rally when I'm able to, and if I were, I wouldn't just print a copy of the rush. And, like I ain't
Tosefta Gittin. Here's the Tosefta
yeah,
Gittin.
so I would intend to do that. But so obviously there has to be some degree of translation, but I think that I think that at least as background, in terms of like what this halakhic, like what this nitty gritty can offer, it certainly shows that the halakhic system has been thinking about somewhat similar issues, and that there is something to say about excessive force. So whether or not it could actually fit into a placard, so I don't know if that's necessarily like the only criteria. I think that it should also enable Jews to feel as if it's not just this amorphous tikkun olam. I mean, again, certainly nothing against tikkun olam, nothing against the concept of the usage of tzedek tirdof, but again, they could be like very amorphous, and someone one person's tikkun olam could be
Right.
another person's evil. Like I mean, it just it can be I guess very vague and broad. And using, let's say, at least some of this halachic language, I think could offer a little bit more specifics in terms of rooting these ideas of police accountability within the more specifics of the Jewish tradition.
Right. Great. Someone else. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Rav David, thank you.
Hi.
You
It
expand our understanding of this matter.
Thank you.
How do you see the difference? Where would you draw the line between shogeg and mezid in the Tosefta Gittin? Is it mezid if he wanted to shoot the person, but he thought it was necessary, and now we say no, it wasn't necessary, or is it, or was that shogeg?
So thank you for asking. So I was assuming that, let's say, that the Gemara Bava Kama is assuming that there's absolutely necessary force, and that if there is necessary force, so then so the way I would understand the Gemara in Bava Kama is that I don't know, I'm defending someone who's being beaten up, I have to use force, and that directly causes someone to be hurt, but that force is absolutely necessary. But in other words, I know what I'm doing, I know I'm causing, but this degree of force is absolutely necessary. I think, again, based on the Chazon Yechezkel, but I mean, actually in my article, I discussed lots of other different perspectives on those series of Toseftas. But at least in my understanding of Yechezkel Abramsky, the Chazon Yechezkel, what's going on is, I don't know, I need to do some either minimal use of force, or I have to do something, and then a result, some degree of harm or damage takes place, that was not my intention. I don't know if, let's say, I'm taking I'm using the least degree of force possible, but yet by accident, I don't know, I cause some degree of harm, even though I'm taking the best steps in order to minimize force. So that degree of unintentional damage, I think, is what would be covered by the Tosefta in Git. Again, but there's lots of other commentators that try to put these Toseftas together, and actually these series of and I just did one Tosefta in Gittin, but there's as you'll see from the source sheet, there's a number of others, and actually, and this discussion of immunity is actually greatly discussed by other halachic authorities with regards to the issue of medical malpractice. To what degree are doctors given immunity or exemption from any accidental damage they cause? So yes, I mean, it's certainly much richer and more open to interpretation than what I could possibly summarize in just 5 minutes.
Great. Let's see if there's one more question here.
Hi, Rabbi. So looking at Bava Kama 28a, looking at Bava Kama 28a, at what point would this be considered like that the wife saving her husband?
Mm-hmm.
If we can look at a situation where there is no other alternate, or sometimes these things happen in a moment of heat of passion,
yeah,
how is intent put into the way? Because if her first thing is, let me grab the attacker's genitals, is that I just need to get him off my husband. And normally, how would halakhically you have to deal with the intent of the wife?
Oh, okay. Oh, wait, in other words, I just want to make sure I understand your question correctly. To what degree is intent relevant with regard to causing damage in general, or
yes,
harm? Oh, okay. So
causing intent and damage. Yes.
Okay. So this also relates to something that I glossed over very quickly. But in general, I think it's the Gemara in Bava Kama Vav. I mean, 26a was it? But the Mishnah in Bava Kama
28a.
Oh no! I'm talking about a different source that says that a person is always liable even for unintentional damage, and so generally, unless that particular action or use of force was absolutely necessary and justifiable, otherwise the halacha for a regular person outside of, let's say, the shliach based and out of the exemption that a shliach based is given, someone who causes unintentional damage or harm is liable for any damages, even though it was an accident. Now, obviously, if it was in the case of the woman, this was an action of saving her husband. If that degree of force was absolutely necessary, so then irrespective of any intent, so then she's exempt. But if it is an action that objectively is not necessary, so then certainly for an irregular person, for a civilian, then they would be liable for even for unintentional damage.
Great.
Thank you.
Great questions. So do you want, Rabbi Polsky, do you want to offer some closing remarks?
Oh, okay. So I didn't know I had time for it, but basically, at the very
in our last 2 minutes here, yeah.
Okay, so at the very end of my source sheet, sources 30 and 31, have an idea of about judges or about people who enforce the law, and actually this source actually I think I sort of got from Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein. I think this particular, anyway, but so I'm Rabbi Yonasan Keneged Makel or Tzua Tehei Zaris, that those who enforce the law should be very vigilant with regard to with regard to the rod and the strap. So what does that mean? So according to Tosfos and source 31, it means that they should be very vigilant to prevent themselves from using force without necessary, that they should not cause excessive fear on the part of the community. That very often, I'm sure, again, because I'm white, I don't personally, I'm privileged to not have to experience this, but on the part of many marginalized communities, too many have to perceive police officers as people to fear, and that should not ideally be the relationship between any community and the law. That those who enforce the law, Toso says, should not cause the community excessive fear, but rather there should be a much more positive relationship. So again, so hopefully, I hope that again that this could be part of a larger conversation, and that to provide a greater, deeper thought about bringing police to greater degree of accountability, but also to have more positive relationships with communities of color.
Amazing, amazing, Rabbi Polsky. Thank you so much for this. There's so much more to think about and learn here, and we look forward to reading this big article coming out and continue learning with you, and keep up all your amazing work. And friends, tomorrow we're going to learn with Professor Mira Wasserman about strangers in a strange text, non-Jews in and around the Talmud. That's tomorrow at noon Pacific, 3 Eastern. Thank you all so much for joining us, and lots of bracha.
Following along, and thank you so much for participating, and thank you to Reb Shmuley and Rabbi, and thank you to everyone who joined in. Thank you very much.
Have a great day. Cool too.